Well, hello guys. This is Infinite Flasher. Today I'm going to be talking about what happened in round two. I didn't cover round one, but I've basically I'm only covering round two today because round one was a bit, let's say, unexciting. None of the games piqued my interest, but today there were a lot of games that were interesting. And in this Russian semifinal, Russian Championship tournament for hosted in where else than Russia, right? Um, there were a lot of good players in this tournament, so I think I decided to cover this. I could have also, I could, I'm also going to be covering games from the Qatar Masters. If anything pops up that's interesting, I'll be posting that. But there's three interesting games in this tournament that happened, and well, I couldn't resist. So let's see what happened. In this game, we have Ian I can't pronounce this. Neponiachi. Ah, God, I have such a bad pronunciation of his name, and we have Karyakin playing black. Of course, we all know he's a perennial top 10 player in the world. Let's see what happened in this game. He's playing white, and Karyakin's playing black. In this game, we have Ian just playing f4. That's actually what I play as white, and I'm surprised that we saw any 2700 GM playing f4. Surprisingly, and it's rarely seen at those longer time controlled games anymore. Very surprising. And Karyakin goes for d5. I think black's most challenging option is definitely e5 in this position, but that's a completely separate debate. d5, knight f3, g6. And we soon get a Leningrad Dutch formation with reverse colors. c6 is an interesting move um, to basically allow the queen to jump to the square at any moment. Knight c3 by Ian. The normal move is queen castles, but I think queen here is just allowing a lot of pressure to appear on b2. So I mean, certainly white could castle, but after queen d6, white would have to play d4, and this is not a normal stonewall that he likes to allow in this position. So instead, he plays knight c3 first, and after knight h6, certainly another reasonable move. We saw d3 by white, going for a normal Leningrad Dutch position after castles here. So here Karya can castle also. I mean, that's reasonable, but he played d4, advancing a pawn in the center and taking advantage of these weak dark squares in the center. But black doesn't. If I know from experience as a Dutch player that I wouldn't mind this d pawn push. I'm already used to this kind of stuff, and I don't mind moving the knight to the square as Ian does in this game. And this kind of formation is very interesting actually. White has interesting chances to break down the center and push on the king side eventually. You'd be surprised how dangerous this position can be for the black side if you're not careful. In this game, Karyakin shows a safe move in knight d7, but I think white is doing really well in this position after the safe and simple c3 pawn push. It's hard to recommend anything else. Knight d7 just seems so normal, so I can't blame him for that. c3 is normal as well. And now we saw Karyakin play knight f5, defending the pawn on d4 in the center. You might be wondering, what about f5? But this always leaves this gaping hole in e6. So knight g5 is pretty much meeting that square immediately. And the normal d takes c3, knight e6 captures, takes here, probably knight f6 now. And black is up a pawn, but it's kind of a measly weak pawn if you ask me. And white actually has a nice shot with knight e6 to leave the king in the center. Notice that bishop e6 is met by knight g5, and if white doesn't take this, he's going to be down a piece. If black doesn't take that, he's going to be down a piece, so he's got to take with the king. And now knight e5 leaves the king stranded in the center, so white is clearly better in this position. So that's why not f5, but instead of knight f5. And the only problem with this is that white has a safe and simple route to a nice position. And this continuation is pretty much forced from here. Takes, push. Bishop back, and now d4. White has created a nice stonewall center with a nice bishop right over here. I think white is more comfortable in this position, definitely. He has a nice center here and safe king with castles, and I never really understood what's the big idea of this setup. It's safe for black and solid, but white is also solid and has very nice center pawns here. So I think white is better in this position. And we see that Ian is slowly mowing down Karyakin with this nice knight on c5. And even though Karyakin is putting his pieces in the center, I guess he's not really sure how to place his pieces, really. Sure, that he has no bad pieces, but white has a target here, nice bishop here to support and attack the queenside pawns, and you can see the queenside coming under pressure with those rooks coming to center and the pawn coming to b4. This position is very unpleasant for black. And now white played rook f2. Certainly bishop d2 is also fine, no doubt about that. That's a fine move, but rook f2 is mainly designed to allow bishop d2 without running into e5. Also, you can think about bringing a rook over here, think about bringing a rook over here. This is a multi-purposeful move, not a bad one at all. And now knight e6. Clearly this knight is blocking this bishop's path, so white doesn't want to trade the knight. Trading the knight allows black to get this bishop out in the open really, and try to develop itself. So white actually just retreated the knight to d3, and it leaves black in a precarious situation. So he chose to develop the bishop d7. Maybe it was time to sacrifice. I'm not really sure, and allow this kind of structure. And I think that I think black is not doing good in this position, but I mean with that kind of maneuver coming on these dark squares right over here, I think white would be clearly better in that position, but maybe that's the relatively best chance for black to salvage something here. Instead he played bishop d7 and just gets himself into a nasty position here with queen a3, and normal regrouping is necessary, but I'm not really sure what black's plan is here in this position. And after this we saw a few more waiting moves in this position, white's just basically trying to slowly pressure the queen side and not doing anything drastic. As we can see, black is struggling to find a plan here, so why not leave him in his own goo. Rook b8 to defend the b7 pawn, bishop d2 to basically allow the rook to come to c1, I suspect, and possibly bring this bishop into play eventually. Also, this bishop can be a nice supporter of the center. Sometimes, even though you would consider this a bad bishop, I consider this to be just a nice solid defender of the whole structure. b6 to get rid of this knight out of c5. It's so annoying. And now white finally takes the bishop and gets the bishop pair, and pretty much white's just clearly better in this position. And we see that white is just taking an enormous amount of space, so black really can't tolerate any more of this, so he decides to sack. And we get this kind of position where, okay, we're eventually we get this two pieces for a rook trade where white has the two bishops, and well, even though black has a rook and two pawns for it, well, this bishop on this diagonal is just a monster, and this bishop is also a monster. And white is really a safe king, and really he should probably win the game actually in this position. White's pretty much just winning, and given this long diagonal, I would say that black's king is in real danger, so it kind of makes sense that he's getting up the queens, but the position that he's getting after this kind of stuff is pretty much dreadful for black. And pretty much after here, bishop f1, it turns out that Karyakin actually resigned in this position. I was a bit surprised. I thought even though his position is really bad here, I thought he could play on for a little bit. Let's see. I think after c3, white would probably have to take the rook. Let's see why I was looking at this a little bit, not so closely, but just a bit in depth. But black probably should play c3, so he can force some kind of piece to capture the pawn. So probably the rook would have to take. This bishop kind of feels nice blocking the pawn. Rook b2, rook c7, and black probably should play actively with this rook eventually, trying to get it out. So let's say give a check here and get this rook out to this square. Probably rook b7 to defend the 7th rank at some point, probably with this rook, and that way laterally. But I didn't actually see an immediate white win with bishop c4 and this kind of stuff happening. It didn't look like such a clear win. Probably it's a white win somehow, but I'm not totally convinced that this position, even though it looks fantastic for white, is totally winning. If you guys have time Maybe we can find if Karya can just brain slipped here. I really do think that this position just takes a lot of time to win for white, so I think it might have been worth trying to play on for Karyakin. So overall, I think that was just a great game by Ian Neponimishan. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but that was a very nice demonstration of positional play. A good demonstration for the birds. I learned something with this early um, early knight c3. That usually white never plays knight c3 this early. He usually just plays d3 and castles without much of a second thought. But I like this new knight c3 setup. All right, guys, let's see the next game. So we saw Karyak and lose to Ian Nepotian. I don't know. Can I just call him Pokemon or something? His name's very difficult to pronounce. But in this game we have Morozovich, Alexander Morozovich, famous for um, his opening play in the French defense and various other openings. Just a very creative player in general. And I'm familiar with this other Russian player, Boris Grashev. But anyways, let's see what happens. Morozovich is playing e4. I'm pretty sure he plays everything, but mostly he's an e4 player if I'm not mistaken. We see a Sicilian, and let's see what kind of variation we're getting. Knight c6, that's certainly interesting. I think c4 is a move in this position, bordering English opening territory here. Let's see, knight c3, that's standard, a6, bishop e2. Very, very solid positional chess is going to be happening here, but I suspect that white's going to play f4 soon, right? Castles, knight f6, bishop e3. It looks very standard for a Sicilian. Bishop e7, and finally there goes f4 to aggressively put a pawn like that in the center, trying to advance eventually. This is really typical on the Sicilian. d6, queen e1. This queen really wants to go to one of these two squares eventually. That looks pretty standard as well. One thing also white I would do if I was white is to play a3 to prevent this b pawn coming to this square, or possibly this knight jumping to this square at some point. So that looks pretty normal as well. Castles, queen g3, bringing that queen to the queen side, and now black just took the knight on d4. That looks reasonable as well. I'm sure that b5 is okay too, but he just took, and b5 was played, and we see this idea that I mentioned with a3. So he played that to prevent the b4 idea. Bishop b7, normal looking. King h1. Basically, he just never wants to deal with anything on this diagonal again, and the position is going to be opening up soon. I can see rook e1 and possibly e5 or f5 coming through in this position. Very difficult to tell at the moment what's going to happen. Bishop c6, bishop d3, aiming that piece towards the king side. Queen b7, rook e1. This all looks very normal. I don't have much to say about this position. b4. Yeah, black can also play rook fd8 or something, just like another developing move. Maybe drop the bishop back here to f8 at some point. Maybe not immediately, but somewhat soon would be normal as well. But he played b4. This can't be. It looks so natural. I mean, I'm not going to say it's bad, but it's running into a bit of trouble. In this position, white just captured the pawn here. Also, he can also. My bad, guys. Clicked the wrong line. b4 is played there. Takes. Queen takes. And now, white's got to defend both of these pieces, so he decides to move the knight back here. The bishop defends the pawn, so now the queen really doesn't have a place, since it's probably going to get kicked by c3 or bishop c3 even. So queen b7, and now e5. The pawn was a little bit pressured too much in this position, so white's really got to advance it in this position. And we saw the knight go to the flank here. Notice that there's pressure on this pawn, so it makes sense to play queen h3. And this knight really can never move because of the mate right over here. So g6 was to play to defend the knight, possibly jump back here if white ever thought about g4 in this position. If king g1 and g4 is definitely an idea, but maybe not here. This long diagonal is a good deterrent for that. Yeah, in this position, Morozovich played knight g3, and, well, I suspect that knight g7 is not very friendly to play. I mean, you can even think about a move like even f5, just sacrificing. This is not necessarily the best move, but is certainly an idea, just breaking through the position. And this kind of position is, okay, probably it's not working, but I guess one idea is that maybe queen g4 is also on, maybe not immediately. Okay, fine, let's just play rook f2 or something, and followed by queen g4, h4, h5. That position is very uncomfortable for for black to play. I think white's just much better here. That's just one idea. I'm sure that white has many paths to a very good game. Probably also taking and opening up this diagonal is also a good way. But in the game, we saw the knight just capture the knight over here, and Morozovich just plays h takes g3, opening up the h file here and possibly allowing this pawn roller to basically happen in the game. But in this position, we saw Greshov take on e5. I don't think this is a bad move at all. Let's see. Bishop takes looks normal, and now bishop b4. I don't think this is a good move. I think Morozovich's next move is very natural and just leaving black with more questions than answers. Like, why did he play bishop b4 given white's next move? You'll see why this is bishop b4 is really silly in the end. It's hard to give him advice, though. I mean, white's definitely has a plan over here to apply some pressure here eventually. Maybe with rook f2 and this kind of stuff, it's very annoying to make progress. It's annoying to defend this position constantly. There's going to be weaknesses appearing on black's king side, and white's army is all developed, and it doesn't feel nice for black at all. But after bishop b4, we saw the strong move bishop f6. Queen h6 is coming here in this position, so you can't really capture because of queen h6 and it's already mate. You can't do anything about that. Bishop f6, and we saw black retreat the bishop here before queen h6 is ever an idea. Bishop takes e7 is really the only move. Normally you want to keep the bishop here in this position, but what are you really going to do in this kind of position against this bishop, which is always really following your bishop? And by taking the bishop over here for white, you're always weakening these squares, so these squares can be really occupied by any of white's pieces, and if you see the coordination along this file, it kind of makes sense what white's next move is. f5, just pounding through the black position, and it's very uncomfortable for black, I think. Rook fe8 was played by black, but Morozovich actually takes advantage of these dark squares by now actually just pushing the pawn here to f6. He could have also just taken, and after this, I think bishop c4, bishop d7, and rook e4 is just giving white a nice position. Simple as that. It just looks very nice for white. This pawn is always weak. There's always weaknesses here along the file, along these dark squares. I mean, white's just better in this position, I think. We saw f6, and after this, queen c5, activating the queen, is pretty much leading to a good position. I like white's position, but I guess it's not so clear. Black has to really defend precisely in this position. So rook f4 was designed against queen h5, trying to trade queens in this position. If black gets a queen trade, I'm thinking he's quite alright in this position. So we saw, instead of queen h5, we actually saw queen g5 in this position. Rook h4, getting the rook along this file. Black really can't take this because of rook h7. That's really bad for black. So of course that drops the queen. Let's not do that. I'm at h5. He wants to block down the open file here. Black does, and we saw rook f1 now to really protect the pawn. And white now has a really subtle threat in this kind of position with bishop g6, and pretty much this is a really tough position to play. I was looking at this position for a little bit and I couldn't really understand it at first, but I think I understand it a little bit better, that with the following move, black is able to really draw the game. In this position, black probably should play rook ed8, and after that, bishop takes g6 is actually not that great because the bishop takes g2, takes, and now black has rook d2. Probably followed by queen d5, I think, and it should be quite alright for black, this position. The problem with the game continuation with rook 88 is that it's running into bishop takes g7, but after rook d2, I think that also bishop takes g2 in this position is leading to an okay position too for black. Now that I look at it, I think white probably could take with the queen, and after this we have probably black surviving this kind of position. It doesn't look nice with the queen and the rook coordinating there, but probably black can play eventually rook d5 to protect the pawn, and he should be okay in this position. I think I'm wrong about the position entirely, actually. Maybe after this takes and bishop takes g2, maybe this position's also quite okay for black, I think. I think this is also a plausible line. I'm not sure why Boris Grayshev didn't go for that. Maybe he was in severe time trouble and didn't consider the line. Not sure. But rook a8, bishop takes g6 is running into trouble. Here in this position, black actually decided to play rook d2, and the problem with this move, it's just running into the very nice tactical shot, bishop takes h5. All the tactics work out for white in this position, it turns out. But even though black is winning the queen here, with this continuation, white has a tremendous attack coming, with the bishop coming back here, and the rooks coming to the e and to the g and the h files, as we see. Queen d2 check comes, rook f2, queen c1. It's already really difficult for black, surprisingly. You'd be surprised, actually. After bishop e2, black is nearly lost in this position. Rook f4, that check right there is very deadly for black, and it's already really difficult to defend this position for him. Queen e3, and I mean, there's not real much advice I can give you. If you see another move, I'd be surprised. Like, this just looks like such a weak king. Bishop d3 is aiming towards the king side right over here. Rook h7 and bishop h7 are already ideas, but the main threat is just rook f4, rook g4, and black is toast. e5 to prevent rook f4, but now we saw this check, and the problem is black really has to run over here. We saw the other rook jump to f5, and here it turns out that black just resigned the game. There's not much of a defense against rook h5, so I can't. It's just a devastating attack here on the king side. I'm pretty sure that black should have gone for bishop takes g2 earlier. After bishop takes g6, he just should go for this one and trade off the bishops here, and diverting the queen's attention from the h5 pawn, and this is a better way of surviving the game. So anyways, a missed opportunity for Boris Grayshev. Still a hard game to defend, I guess, against Morozovich, but a good attacking game. I like this idea by Morozovich. Just a brilliant move, really, to see bishop takes g6, weakening the structure with this f7 check, pawn check. If black took with the pawn right over here, and if queen takes, then I probably should mention that rook h5 is already threatening that, so that's not very comfortable for black either. Notice that rook f4, rook g4 is also on the cards as we expect, so very uncomfortable game for him, but a good win by Morozovich. So let's see the next game, guys. In this game we have, let's see, I don't know how to pronounce his name, amazing, Denis Kismatullin versus Vadim Zivjagintsev. I've heard of this guy's name, actually. He's famous for the 93 Sicilian for the white side. I'm pretty sure he's this guy. I think he's beaten some really famous grandmaster in this line. Quite amazing game. You guys should check this out, by the way. But in this game, we saw something completely else, something entirely, but with an English opening formation, gone to a Panov Botnovic, not Panov, just a Panov Caro-Kann, an early g6 fianchetto. I think this line is notoriously annoying for black to play because of this queen b3 line. Lately in practice, it's not been the most ideal opening because black is getting this pin on the c6 square and doubling the white, no, not doubling the pawns, but just leaving white black with an isolated pawn here in the c file, and that's really the theme of this game for the most of the game. And castle, this is all really known theory in this kind of position. This kind of structure is really commonly known among all grandmasters, really. Even though black has this very uncomfortable pawn, he has the bishop pair to compensate. But I don't know. I've always really favored white in these kind of structures. This is just a really nice pawn controlling these squares, and his bishop, even though it doesn't look very active coming to the square, eventually it's going to be kicked. White really is active play himself with the rooks coming to the center file. We'll see what happens. He actually starts with knight a4, another move that makes sense controlling that square. So Knight 8, bishop a6, pretty much gaining a tempo on this rook, right? So the white rook's got to go to e1, rook b8 getting a tempo on the queen, queen d1 dropping the queen back, and now c5. At first I thought this was dropping a pawn for basically nothing, and it probably is really dropping a pawn for nothing. This pawn is just pathetically weak, but notice that this bishop doesn't really have a role for the future after knight c5, so black's idea is by jettisoning the pawn with that takes in bishop b7, his idea is to activate this light squared bishop along this diagonal without dealing with the pawn here on the c6 square. At first I thought white would have taken this bishop, but I think that probably just black would just take, and I don't know, maybe white would play b3 to try to consolidate queen d6, and I mean, black is just going to be down a pawn. He has reasonable compensation with this very nice knight on d5, but I think white would just be worse. Black would just be worse in this position because he's down a pawn. I thought that's what white would have done, but he played b3 first. Nothing wrong with that move, but let's see what happens. Bishop a8 to preserve this bishop. I'm not sure why white didn't take it again. I would have really preferred to just capture the light squared bishop. Bishop g5. Black brought the knight back. And the problem is we see this queen coming to the d5 square with this nice long-term sniper bishop coming and just coordinating on this diagonal. It's not very nice for white, as we can see. Rook c1, rook c8, knight e5, queen d5. Just seems very normal for black. Black always has this target to attack in the d4 square, so white's got to worry about that. White's up a pawn, but black has tremendous activity. f3 to blunt this diagonal. It weakens a lot of these squares, but it's probably necessary. And now we saw a very, very nice tactical shot by black in this position, knight g4. Attacking this knight twice and relying on the fact that knight takes g4 is running into queen takes g5. That's not good for black. For white, I mean. Excuse me. I'm not sure. I didn't actually look at this position that in depth. The bishop takes d4 doesn't look that bad either. Probably it's also good for bishop. No, it probably is not good. Never mind, it's not good. Just take the bishop and run with the bishop pair. That's just better for black actually, probably. And of course we know you can't take the knight with the pawn because of mate, so you can't do that either. That's not good. So you cannot play any of those moves, so you probably just have to drop the bishop back here to defend the knight here on the e5 square. And here in this position, black just lashes out with g5. Very, very creative play by black. Seeing that these kind of tactics are in the work here, d4 is extremely weak again, so white has to retreat the bishop once again to keep contact. Bishop g3. But now black really maintains the aggressive play with h5. And this is really, really uncomfortable for black to play. Yeah, in this position, maybe white should play h3. I mean, just trying to capture the knight here, and I don't know, black would probably play h4, and we would get this kind of structure when, white is pretty solid, but in the center, but black has active play, and I think black should be okay. But I still like white because of these nice knights. But instead we saw rook c2 instead of h3. And after this, we saw black just push h4. This bishop now has to move or just die, and then he chose to die. And white chose to give up the bishop, but this kind of structure is very passive, really. This kind of structure I'm talking about, because black is getting all the activity along the c and d files, and I guess we saw with that earlier that bishop g3 move, that the move around there with the rook c2 move instead of pushing h3 is leading to a passive position like this where black has all the open diagonals and open files to play against for white, and I'm not really sure what white's plan is here in this position. We saw knight e4. We're going to see this knight f6 threat coming, so black's got to watch out for that. He played queen f5 to guard against that. And then we saw a nice little tactical trick with knight f6, defending against black's position. The idea is that, okay, you can't take because of knight h6 check. So the king has to move here in this position. That's what happened. And after knight h5, white's probably doing okay. By the way, you might be wondering, doesn't this just win the queen with rook e5? The idea being that rook e5 is forcing the queen to retreat to this square. think that queen g6 is met by let's see. I'm oblivious to tactics right now. Let me just give me a second to figure out the idea. Right, rook g5, and now this queen is essentially trapped in this position because of knight h7. So very nice tactic there. But you might be wondering about queen f4, so you might be wondering what happens here. But I think white is just getting a tempo on the queen, and now the queen is trapped. So black's basically going to sack the queen for really two nice bishops and two nice rooks. Black has very good control over the position, and I think he shouldn't be worse at all. This is certainly possible for black to play, but this is certainly what white could have played, but I can't blame him for not going into it because it appears as if black has a nice position there. Still, white probably should have went for this. I mean, instead of rook e5, we saw the knight go to h5, and after this the bishop retreated. White queen tried to go to e2 to stabilize the position, but it turns out that by moving the queen to this square, white is just blatantly dropping a pawn here, and black's like, okay, I'm going to take it. And we saw this trade happen, rook d1, and the problem is the rook is coming to the c2 square. If I'm rushing, guys, I just don't have enough time to cover this game in too much depth. There's a lot of games that were happening today, so I had to rush a bit, but forgive me for the bit of the lack of analyzing this position. I just have to rush a bit. So rook c2, rook d2, rook c1 is pretty much finishing off white. It's hard to defend this position as white already. Look, if you see these bishops just mowing down your king side, it's not the prettiest sight in the world. So rook d2 is just not a good move. And after this, I guess they were both in time trouble at this point. They're both right near move 40. It's move 33, and I'd imagine that they were both in time trouble. So rook c1, rook d1. Black could have played queen b1 immediately, but he played rook c2, and white decided to play rook d2 and this repetition first before playing queen b1, and this trade happened with the king taking on c2, but now white's king goes under a huge attack with queen g1 and queen h1. White is just struggling enormously in this position, and now we realize that pretty sure white couldn't play king g3 in this position because I think queen h1, and well, now that you have queen h4 on mate there, so knight h2 has to come, and probably bishop g1, and you can't hold this anymore, so white can't play that. Instead of king g3, we saw king h3 with this check, and now the knight has to drop back here, and the difference is that in this position white can defend this knight with queen e5 in this position with the king impeding this diagonal, so that's kind of an improvement. But black now has the great breakthrough move g4, just destroying the black position, and in this position we see that white can't take here because of I think the captures on g2 with the queen, and well, I mean the knight is just dropping in this position, and black doesn't really have any threats against white doesn't really have any threats against the white king, so it should work out for black. Excuse me, guys. In this position, instead of the pawn captures, we saw the king capture, but after this we saw the white queen actually take on g2 first. A nice intermediate move. I think if queen takes h2, I think white is probably just checking and taking the bishop here in the corner. That's probably really okay for white. So black doesn't want to allow that. He decides to take here on g2 first, and the idea is that after this the knight retreats, bishop f2, putting more pressure on the position. The whole position is in shambles for white, as now the knight has to be defended again. I mean, since it's already trapped, so he's got to bring the knight over here, but now black can pretty much just take the pawn here on f3, since that knight is not defending the f3 pawn. And this position is a complete disaster for white. I think the bishop pair is just too strong in this position. We saw these moves actually happen, and in this position, I mean, the computer just recommends queen f4, but this is just totally lost after this kind of continuation where the bishops just dominate the knights here. These bishops are just going to scoop up these queenside pawns, and these two pass pawns are just too much for white. That's the best that white can do but instead we saw this queen e5 check, and after king g6, um, white actually just resigned the game. There's no defense against queen h1, I think. Queen g2 followed by queen h1 in this kind of position with f5 check happening. The idea is that after, let's say, a wasteful move like b4, black is giving this check, followed by this check. You can play f5 first, but I mean, this check is also good enough, really. This check, this king has to move here, and now f5 is pretty much destroying white from the inside here. Queen f3 mate is coming with king f4, so very, very annoying position for white to play. I think this is just a very strange game, honestly. Very tough game for white to play. I mean, black sacked the pawn, and I'm still baffled by why white didn't just capture the bishop over here. Black would have been pretty much always worse in this kind of position after b3 and bishop b2. Sure, he has the bad bishop here, but you know, it's a pawn, and I think I would have taken the pawn over the position that he got in the game with the light squared bishop still on the board here. It's a very dangerous piece, so I think a well-played game by black to sacrifice the pawn and try to gain very solid activity on the king side with this pawn advance. Very good use of all the pieces. So after a couple rounds, I think, if I remember the situation, we have, I think, Vadim right here, just in the lead for first place, tied with Morozovich and Naposh. I forgot to pronounce his name, but Ian, we'll just call him Ian. And I think that they're also tied with another player. I think his name was Igor Lysage, if I remember correctly. He beat Nikola Videogov yesterday, and that was an interesting game. I could have also covered, but I chose not to. He beat Videogov when Videogov decided to do Greek gift sacrifice against him, and it turns out it didn't work out for him, but Igor won an interesting game there. Anyways, guys, this is round 2 from the Russian Championships. I know this video is a bit long, but forgive me and for that, but hope you like this video. Like, subscribe, and all the other good stuff that I appreciate you guys doing. See you around.